All right, so this is the second section of Unit 3. And so this is what I call the roller coaster. Roaring 20s was high, everything's great. And the Great Depression is the crash coming down. Everything falls apart here, okay? So when we start talking about the Great Depression, if you get a chance to Google this, it's a really good review of everything that happens and some main stuff that's in our TEKS that could be on state test. America, Story of Us, the name of the episode is Bust, and it's all about the Great Depression. And it has some good stuff that you can actually look at if you get a chance to. But this is the Great Depression as we know it. There's no real for sure date. We kind of just slide into it in a rapid pace, but it gets so bad. If you look at some of these pictures, you'll see anything from stock market crash, right? Billions lost. A stockbroker lost everything in the stock market. He sold his car for $100. That's not a Model T Ford. That's a pretty expensive customized car, right? Here we have, this actually is a picture that's supposed to represent the ironic part of the Great Depression. And the poster in the background was the 1920s, and supposedly these people are for the soup line. But if you actually look this up, there's a whole thing where that's not entirely true. But for years, everybody was taught it. But nonetheless, you got unemployment at all-time record high, people looking for work, standing in lines for just one job. All these guys would compete for it. Or they're standing in the soup line or bread line or sometimes a coffee line. You see people from the Great Plains suffer quite a bit. It's one of the most infamous pictures of the Great Depression by photographer Dorothy Lang, which we'll talk about her as well. And you even have the rise of hobos in some areas. So Great Depression is known as an all-time low in the U.S. So we got to go, how do we get there? First, overproduction is an issue. Overproduction is pretty much self-explained. The more you produce, the less it's worth. And at this point in time, it's worth very little, and so you're not making any money. You also have overproduction when people aren't buying. So if people aren't buying and have all this in the warehouse or storefront and nobody's buying it, you're not making money. You're actually in debt when you think about it. Another big issue here is buying on margin. That's kind of new for some students, so let me go ahead and talk about that. I mentioned it in some of my other classes when I talk about speculation in the roaring 20s. But buying margin was essentially you borrowed like 10%, or you paid 10% down, borrowed 90% of a loan, and then you invested in the stock market. And that was pretty good for most of the 1920s. But once you hit like 1939, if you look at this down here, you see it all come crashing down. And now if you're taking out a loan to, invest in stock market, and you're borrowing 90% of it, and the stock market busts, you're in trouble. You've got a loan to pay back, and you weren't prepared for it because you assumed you would get that rebound from the stock market. That whole speculation is pretty bad. When you're risking everything to buy low, sell high, that's speculation. But when you do it on margin, when you're buying it on a loan, that's just asking for trouble. There's even a run on the banks at one point in time, and very simply put is a run on banks. It started off, the story goes that apparently somebody tried to withdraw money from the bank, and the bank was trying to convince them not to do it. And it started as a rumor in New York. Well, the next day, they print this story, and people freak out, and they run to the bank to get their money back. Back then, the banks didn't save your money. At that point in history, if you put money in the bank, you were investing in the bank. So if I put my life savings in the bank, $100,000, the bank would take that money and invest in the stock market or invest in different things. And the idea was I was loaning the bank money and they were going to use it, and they kept it safe for me. But with the stock market crash, people began to worry that the banks were going to crash. And so when people went to get their money out of the banks were like, no, it's going to be okay. Now we're going to bounce back. No. But people were demanding their money. And after a while, so many people came. In the first couple of days, so many people came to banks to pull their money out. The banks didn't have any more money. They had lost what was remaining in the stock market. It's some pretty shaky banking business going on. They just pretty much invested people's money without a care. And some banks would just lie and continue to lie about having the money. But we'll get how FDR fixes that later. We also have the highly smooth tariff, which we talked about before. We have the largest tariff in U.S. history. We have a tariff with Great Britain. Britain has a tariff on us. We stop trading back and forth, and we have restricted global trade. Nobody wins. You're paying more for a product, and you lost a lot of customers. If there's a tariff, you pay more for a product. And if they put a tariff on you, you lost a whole country of customers. So you're making less, your country's making less money. Tariffs are a horrible idea. This is the biggest self-evident proof of it. I have some questions here. If you guys ever want to try these, hit pause and try to give them an answer. I'm going to go through these relatively quick because this is for my students who missed class or need a refresher for it. But Star has asked a few questions from the Great Depression. Now, some people argue it's all the stock market crash that started all this, and it is part of it. October 29th is Black Tuesday. Stock market crashes, rebounds a little bit at the end of the day, but then it crashes even more. And so people lost money in the stock market. Only 2% of Americans actually own stock. So it's a wide myth that the stock market caused it all. It didn't. It was a ripple effect. As companies had no money to invest or no money from investments, they began to suffer. When people got scared and quit spending money, people quit buying things because they're scared to spend their money. So people quit buying things. That means you have less production, and you have overproduction that's already out there. People get laid off because companies can't sell. It's a ripple effect. The crash just starts mainly, only 2% of Americans have stock, but the ripple effect is what really helped. There's no unemployment insurance at that time. The government doesn't have that. Remember, laissez-faire, hands off. So there's no help from farmers who are going to suffer here in a little bit. The government pretty much says, hey, turn to charities, turn to a church. They can help you. But even churches and private charities, it was too much for them. They couldn't support this entire population of people that were suffering. This is the Great Depression. Writers like John Steinbeck, he would write Grapes of Wrath, which covered a family that left the Dust Bowl area to go out to California and try again. Photographers like Dorothy Lang, she would have pictures like here above, like this one down here on the bottom of the right, to show how bad it was. It's an infamous one I showed you earlier. She took pictures of human suffering to remind people not about it, to show people what was going on in other parts of the world. Because you got to think about it, here in the Great Plains, they didn't know that about what was going on over here. Hey, sorry, I got interrupted. But what I was saying is, like, the photographers were really important because people in like the cities here did not know what was going on over here with the Dust Bowl. So photography and for historical purposes, but also just for information at the time, people just didn't know that, right? The Dust Bowl is a big part of the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl is not economics. It is climate issue, really, when you think about it. And climate just means long term. But what began in the Great Plains and this area, there's no trees in this area. It's called the Great Plains. When you don't have trees to slow down wind, we have wind picked up quite a bit. That's why this is called Tornado Alley, because tornadoes happen all throughout here. Even in northern Texas, around the Dallas area, you'll hear about these tornadoes that form. Once you have loose dirt, dry drought periods, and wind picking up, you create what we have here, the Dust Bowl. Essentially, you need to understand for any written test question, it's caused by droughts and over-farming. For generations, they farmed the land. The topsoil, the very top of it that you loosen up and you can plant, it was gone. It blew away. Over-farming and tons of drought affected the soil, made it so thin that when these winds picked up, it carried these huge storms, literally just across the country. At one point, you could see the dirt from the Great Plains. You could see it all the way in New York at one point. It's pretty horrendous when you think about how bad it was. It got to a point where over 1 million farmers would give up. People in the Great Plains gave up, and they packed their cars, and they headed out to California to find work. Those people were known as Okies. About 1 million farmers are going to give up and leave the Great Plains. When you look at the Dust Bowl, it's no joke. These pictures kind of show you how bad things get. Storms roll in as fast as they can. And it's settled over the area consistently. Some of these do go all out to New York, even all the way out to D.C., but the living conditions here are pretty horrible and dangerous. Again, if you get a chance to watch that episode of American Story of Us, episode 9, called Bust, it has a really good scene where you experience and feel the experience that they saw. Here's a picture of Okies, people who gave up and decided in the Dust Bowl area, they gave up and said, hey, we're going to head out to California to find work, or Washington, some big major city. They couldn't make it in the Great Plains. Okay, so here's some practice questions for you. You do have to know when we talk about immigration constantly throughout United States history. First is the Chinese. Then in the last section we talk about the Immigration Acts of the 1920s for targeting Europeans. But we never talk about anything from Latin America for a reason. Latin America was always an ally of the United States as far as labor. When labor is needed, the United States has always looked south. So much in the 1920s, 500,000 visas were given for people to come over. 1930s, 33,000. It's a big difference. And of course, as always, when the economy goes south, who do we blame? Americans tend to blame immigrants. They're taking our jobs. We hear this all the time, right? So American farmers would blame immigrants for taking their jobs, even though the work the American farmers didn't want to do, right? And Herbert Hoover, the great president and in the beginning of the Great Depression, will actually authorize a special Mexican Repatriation Act. And essentially, it would deport Mexican Americans without a trial, load them up on train cars, and ship them down south to Mexico. We think roughly half of them are actually lawful American citizens. 60% of children sent back were born in America. 60%. But for the American government, it didn't matter. Let's fill this out without thinking twice. So when we look at history and we're like, oh, it could never happen, it has happened before. People have warned this is very much can happen again when we blame a specific group of people for one issue or one cause, when we scapegoat. That's what happens. So Mexican Repatriation Act was just that. It was a deportation issue for any Mexican American. And I love this actually in one a textbook, not our textbook, but a textbook. He points out the border only exists when Mexican labor was not needed. And it's true. Because 1930s, Great Depression, we don't want anybody coming over. We want to take care of ourselves, and that's it. But by 1960s, we have special programs begging workers to come to America to work in the fields. And I feel like we're going to see that again, the way history is repeating itself. But that's me being hypothetical and just guessing, really. But it's anybody's guess at this point in history. All right, how did Hoover halt the Depression? He doesn't. Remember, this guy believes in laissez-faire, hands off, government stays out of it. He does throw down the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but all that did was give loans to the business, and then you hope that the business would create jobs. And we call that the trickle-down theory. It's a joke. It's this idea that if we give money to the top, eventually the aid and help, the money will eventually get to the bottom. You see from this cartoon, that's just not the case. And this idea, the aid is a metaphor for water, and eventually none of it gets to the very bottom, right? The banks get the money, the banks get the money, the businesses get the money, the people might get some of it, but the workers never get it. And you can see from these photos who Americans blame for the Great Depression. They don't blame local government as the norm was. No, if you look, they're blaming one man alone, Hoover. Look at this. Give you some idea of who to blame. Hard times are still hovering above us, right? If you look, shanty towns or all these shacks here, these popped over major cities all the time, and they actually call them Hoovervilles. It shows you who they blame for this, Herbert Hoover. There's even a movie called Cinderella Man that takes place in Great Depression. They have a specific scene that shows the Hooverville scene, how dangerous it is. It's just a bunch of shacks put together at the last minute. When people moved to cities to find work, they couldn't afford to live in a city, so they took whatever material they could find and built these makeshift homes. They're technically called shanty towns, but they get nicknamed Hoovervilles because of the president at the time. So you can understand that Hoover, his idea was, hey, laissez-faire. He tried to RFC, but it's too little, too late. The simple way to put that is just too little, too late, and it didn't work out. So people who blame the Great Depression on the president. Now, even on this one, I don't do anything on my notes for this with the students. The only purpose of this slide is really to put into your mind how bad things are. 13 million people are no longer employed. That's about 25%. That's 25% of the population with no job. Other 40%, if you take everybody else that was still employed, 42% the rest employed lost 42% of pay cuts. So it wasn't just unemployment. It's if you did have a job, you lost half your pay. That's how bad it was to even keep a job. So the human toll on depression, as the slide points out, is pretty ridiculous. There's even the growth of hobos. Employed man would just give up. Unemployed man would just give up on families, jump on trains, and move place to place. And there's all kinds of history on this. If you ever get interested in majoring in history, you can focus on the Great Depression. And the hobos even had their own alphabet or secret code. They would carve these outside home. So if it was like a home that was not safe, the people were threatening. If they saw a hobo, they'd carve this into like a wood post or something like that nearby. If it was, there's one for food. I don't see it on here, but there's one where it's like free doctor, right? Hobos arrested on sight, beware, that's dangerous. If they got dogs, watch out for the dogs. You can see these carvings all over the place. They literally create their own little language for fellow hobos to see. So even hobo grew quite a bit. The bonus army is a side thing that they no longer ask on a STAR test. The bonus army were the war and veterans. They came to D.C. They wanted their pensions. They wanted it early. Things were so tough. They came, and of course they brought their family. People were unemployed, and they camp out D.C. waiting for Congress to vote to give them their pension early. And Congress says, no, we're not giving them the pensions. We can't afford it. And the veterans from World War I just refused to leave. They got nowhere else to go. They decided to camp out and stay there. And essentially what's happened is the U.S. Army is called in to clear it. And you can see U.S. Army along with D.C. Police use violence to clear the veterans. Now, there's a big debate about who ordered this. Hoover says, I did not order this. The commanding general says that Hoover did. It wasn't me, it was Hoover. Nonetheless, if you're president and you're blamed for attacking veterans, you don't get reelected in America. This is nicknamed the bonus army because they wanted the bonus early. But if you're Hoover, you got a tough time getting reelected. I stopped to add these slides in here for my students to talk about. If you see these four things, speculation, overproduction, trade restriction, banking practices, and you see these arrows going to Great Depression, what would you title a slide? Causes of Great Depression, right? Compare that to this next one. You've got the Great Depression here. You have a line, business failures, unemployment, bank failures, foreclosures on homes and farms. I would call that the effects of the Great Depression. And that's there so you keep that in your mind. When you see stuff on paper, it's not the same as when you see it on a slideshow. But the causes and effects are pretty straightforward. We've covered all these. You should know them by now, right? And so here's some practice questions. You can see why I add those in there. Leads you to that. There's a couple. There's one. There's a few questions about the Great Depression. But the big thing isn't necessarily the Great Depression. It's our reaction to the Great Depression. Hoover does not get reelected, especially after the bonus army. He got no chance at all. Serves one term. People blame him. They get rid of him. Instead, everybody must vote for the opposite party. They're going to go Democrat. And this guy right here, and it's probably the greatest Democrat president we've ever had, personal opinion, is FDR. Okay? His promise is called the New Deal. He goes, I promise a new deal for Americans. That's his campaign slogan. And what this New Deal does, it changes the course of history. After this, America expects the government to do a couple of things. One, the government is in charge of making sure the economy runs smooth. Before this, we didn't blame the government. It was just part of life. Now we expect the government to make sure the economy runs smooth. If it starts to falter, if inflation goes up or anything, we expect the government to do something about it. Also, the big takeaway from the Great Depression is essentially, the big takeaway from the Great Depression is now the government will be incredibly large. Before, the federal government was not as control of your everyday life. You didn't see them that much. You weren't affected by them. It was mainly foreign policy, things like that. But now the New Deal has all these programs built in that the federal government is going to increase in size and power. They're going to have a lot more control, a lot more influence on your everyday life. You're going to see that here. It'll tell itself out here in just a little bit. All right, Roosevelt's philosophy and his style when he first comes in. Remember, back then, he didn't take office till March. So for 4 months, it was pretty much a lame duck Congress, lame duck president, didn't do anything. This is actually why we will change the Constitution and have the new swearing in of the president in January. Because for 4 months, he couldn't do anything because he wasn't president yet. He had won the election, knew he won, but he had to wait before he could be sworn in office till March. We'll change the Constitution and an amendment to fix that. But in the meantime, this guy took advantage of that time and developed the brain trusts. Everybody he knew, from the best universities, the greatest minds about economies, he put them together and said, how do we fix this and work together? He immediately began fireside chats on the radio. You can see from this gentleman down here, the radios were that big back then, and so they're often in the family room next to the fireplace. And Roosevelt would talk to the people. He took advantage of the radio. He talked to the people every night, from his fireplace side to your fireplace side. He did it to let you know what was going on with the economy, his plan, how they're going to fix it. The famous phrase, "we have nothing to fear but fear itself," is an FDR fireside chat from radio. He did it. The whole point of this was to calm people down. If they knew what was going on and they knew there was a plan, and he could tell them, convey it to them, it made people feel better. That was the whole point of the radio. It made people feel better. Okay. Now, fireside chat's really important for that, but that's not the only thing that happens. His wife plays a big role too. You can't forget Eleanor Roosevelt. Our standards in Texas, you only have to know 2 first ladies, and number 1 is Eleanor Roosevelt. She would go around the country, be his eyes and ears. She pushed for women's rights, civil rights. She hated segregation. We'll talk about it later. We'll talk about Tuskegee Airmen quite a bit. And she wanted to help the poor. And she advocated for peace. She was a wonderful human being. This guy, FDR, was not. He ends up cheating on her so much down his deathbed. Supposedly she's not there, his mistress is. But Eleanor Roosevelt was a saint. One of my favorite quotes from anybody really is, "Small minds discuss people, gossip. Average minds discuss events, history. Great minds discuss ideas." Like, why do things happen? How can we stop this from happening? How can we make it better? It's absolutely genius for her to think of that. We do have the first cabinet member in U.S. history as well. It's no longer a TEKS, so you don't have to know. But Frances Perkins was the first female member of the cabinet. She was Secretary of Labor. That's a big deal at a point in time when unemployment's so bad. So FDR was, I guess you could say, is progressive in that sense, that he would choose a woman for his cabinet. Now, FDR, when he comes in, most of his stuff happens in the first 100 days. Presidents are known for the first 100 days being the most influential. They try to get everything done. It's because you just won an election and you're kind of riding out that popularity. So you can see some of these cartoons. You can see this one, FDR. He has a New Deal program in the back. Essentially, Congress is like a snail, but he's not whipping them to move fast, right? You can see this one's interesting. Sweeping changes are expected after March 4th. You've got Congress handing over the federal reorganization broom to Roosevelt. He's going to reorganize all the federal government, right? And he says the tag to it. Back here you have Uncle Sam, and this is supposed to be Herbert Hoover watching it happen, unfold, right? So there's a lot for FDR to tackle in his first 100 days. Historically, we look at this and you can break it up into 3 sections: relief, recovery, and reform. That's not as important as just knowing the stuff. That's what we're going to get into, okay? So his relief version of it was, first, the banking crisis. How do we help the banks? The run on the banks, people are running to banks, withdrawing all their money. FDR closes all banks. He has a bank holiday. He says for 4 days, all banks will close. The only banks that are allowed to reopen are the ones that can prove to me that they're stable and that they can operate. So all the banks that were open still, even though they didn't have money, no, that's not going to do anymore. Okay. Immediately, he gave some credibility to banks. When some didn't open and others did, people knew they could trust those banks. So the first 4 days, when he does that, the 4-day bank holiday, it has a huge effect on people's morale at the very least. Okay. He does provide relief to homeowners and farm owners. We won't talk about that much, but he is going to provide loans. He actually has resettlement for the farm owners. What I didn't talk about too much was how he fixed the problems of how the government fixed the problems of the Dust Bowl. It's him. When he becomes office, he's going to help subsidize and pay for partial move of farmers. If they want to sell their land and move to better land so they can start farming again, he'll help pay for that. In the Dust Bowl, he'll actually have the CCC, these guys right here we're going to talk about in a little bit. He has them plant trees throughout the Great Plains to slow down the wind. He has farmers go to trainings on how to rotate crops so they don't use all the soil. It takes years, but he does do this. So he does get relief to farm owners and homeowners as well. For unemployed, he believes in work relief. He doesn't believe in automatic money. He says that's going to make people lazy. So he enacts these work relief programs, right? The Federal Emergency Act, you don't have to know that too. I've never seen the ask on STAR test, but he gave money, funded state and local governments. He gave them money to, all right, make a project, got to build a courthouse in your county, build a courthouse, put people to work, make money, right? The federal government gave this local government money to do that. One that they often ask about is the CCC. Essentially, young men that were 18 years old without a family of their own, they were paid to come work on either plant trees in Great Plains, work on national parks, developing bridges, cutting trees, planting trees, whatever parks needed, the CCC did that. And because these guys were so young, most of them didn't have a family of their own. And so if they didn't have a child or a wife, they would work in these national parks and on the road and then send the money back to their parents. And their parents could use the money. Again, it's immediate relief. He's trying to get money into people's pockets. Now, the government goes in debt to pay for the CCC, but that was important to Roosevelt to get people working again, provide relief. Public Works is very similar to that, but it's mainly for federal jobs, building projects like schools, roads, courts, post offices, bridges. Back home where I'm from, all the bridges were made from local rock, and it was a PWA who made it. Essentially, they took their quartz and the other rocks that they found locally, mined it up, and used it to build roads throughout, or bridges throughout the town where I'm from. That's a PWA. Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was a couple years later when they realized, what about other people? Like, yeah, people can work and physically work with PWA and CCC, but what about the artists, the writers, musicians, the painters, the photographers? We're going to pay them to do stuff. So like even here in Baytown where I teach now, the local post office, there's a giant mural in there, a giant painting, and it was done by local artists, and they were paid through the WPA way back in the 1930s. So it put people to work. And once you get people to work, they have money. Once they have money, they can spend money. That's what this first part is about. Okay. Now, government puts money in people's hands, makes them work for it, but it puts money in people's hands. And then people buy products. And if people are buying products, that's going to create jobs, because somebody's got to make those products and sell those products. And if you create jobs, the more people have jobs, people can buy more stuff. And you have this cycle of positivity. We got the cycle going in the right direction. It's really important as far as the economy goes for all that to work perfectly together. Now, here on your notes, I do something different. I go in details on here what these are. The National Industrial Recovery Act, it had business regulations, a minimum wage, set prices. The government was like, you can't charge this much for that. So you can't do that. Set production limits, how much you can produce. It created a whole thing where if you went to a restaurant, they hung an NRA sign, not National Rifle Association, National Recovery Administration, saying, hey, we abide by these rules. So we pay our people minimum wage. We don't charge too much. We do exactly what the government says. We participate in this. But that was declared unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say the federal government can do that. The Agriculture Adjustment Act, AAA, Roosevelt passes that, and what it does, it pays farmers to plant less, burn crops, and slaughter livestock. Because at one point, there was too much of it. After World War I ended, farmers actually suffered because they had all this extra corn and grain, and nobody sold it to, so prices plummeted, actually in the 1920s. They had too much livestock. Nobody could afford the livestock, but the livestock wasn't worth anything. So farmers were getting paid by the government to get rid of the supply so that it'd be worth more and they can make money. But the Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional. Okay? The Supreme Court looked at both these, okay, and said that's unconstitutional. They said, hey, if it's not in the Constitution, it's left up to the states. So these are state rights. States can do this, but you can't. And what amendment tells you, hey, if it's not listed here, it's left up to the states? That's a 10th Amendment. We've got to get used to using the 10th Amendment. It's used all the time in this class. It's a federal government. They don't have the right to do it. The state does. And that's a 10th Amendment. It makes sense as the last of the Bill of Rights, because it sounds like at the very end, our founding fathers were tired of trying to think of everything, and they just said, hey, if it's not here, leave it to the states, pretty much. Okay. Hey, the second AA did pass in 38. Essentially what the government did then was buy your grain. You had extra grain, we bought it, and we stored it. So it wasn't in the supply chain, so it didn't affect prices, and the government could save it in case it needed it. So there was a worker around that eventually. But the Supreme Court jumped on FDR right away and said, hey, it's not in the Constitution, you can't do that. If it's not in the Constitution, the According to the 10th Amendment, it's left up to the states. Okay. Other programs he creates to reform and make sure this never happens again. He has a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. That's a big one that's often asked about. Essentially, your money is insured in the bank. The bank has to prove that they can insure your money. Back in the day, it was up to $250,000 is guaranteed. Your money's somewhere guaranteed. Now it's more than that. He also, FDR, has the federal government start the Tennessee Valley Authority. They realized a lot of people in the Tennessee area, these country rednecks, don't have electricity. And so to make their standard of living better and create jobs, they go to the Tennessee River and other rivers in this area. Remember, these are mountainous areas. And they build all these dams that produce electricity, the hydroelectric dams. So it creates jobs, produces electricity. So now people in the Tennessee Valley area have electricity. And guess what? They need products to run that electricity. So the TVA is a pretty big one. A big one that's under scrutiny today is the Securities and Exchange Commission. The best way to remember that is the word exchange, as in exchange stock. The SEC's job was to watch over the stock market. They create a commission. The job was to make sure there's no insider trading, no crooked stuff getting done. The biggest debate in modern times is, does crypto fall underneath this? Because crypto is not the stock market. It's very similar, but it's not. So right now, there's like no rules to crypto, so it's all over the place. Could we see another Great Depression or some crash of the economy because of crypto? Possibly. But at this point in time, most people are still too leery of crypto, even though that's changing every day as we speak. Bitcoin, for example, is randomly out of control, it feels like. The last one you need to know in this one is the Social Security Act. This is Social Security cards. When you're born, you're given a Social Security number. At this point in time, they didn't have that, so you had to go register yourself. Get a Social Security number, and for the rest of your life, money comes out of your paycheck. And if you reach a certain amount, when you're 60 years old, you will get a check in the mail, a pension. We always call it a pension when it comes to STAR test. You get a pension. It's your retirement check at the end. It's not much. The Social Security is not designed. FDR said this is temporary, but he couldn't stand old people starving. He thought that was wrong, so we had to help the older people. Nowadays, we know Social Security as an ID number, and it wasn't that intention. If you're wondering why that happened, that goes back to 9/11, 2001. Once we have these terrorist attacks, we realized these guys were living in America for years. So now when you get a job, you have to provide a Social Security number to prove that you're not a terrorist, essentially. So for years, that wasn't even an issue. Most of my students think of Social Security as an ID, and it's not intended that way at all. It's actually intended as a retirement benefit from you. So the great thing, and when people complain that they say, illegal immigrants are using Social Security IDs, feel free to use mine, because if you use it, then when I retire, I have a pension from Social Security because somebody else is paying into it. So knock yourself out. All right, you can see some questions here from, you can see I have a few because these are different ones asked. Sometimes, technically, this TEK is that they can ask any agency. There's hundreds of agencies created. The FHA is one, and this is the only year they ever asked for one that was odd, but they could do it. So it is possible, but there's no way to actually teach you all the actual agencies. We call them the alphabet agencies because they all have acronyms like AAA, NRA, FDIC. We have all these acronyms. It's impossible to teach you all of them. So we just stick to the main common ones you can see. Again, if you're going through these, hit pause on the video and you can practice those questions. Okay. Now, the monetary policy at the time, this should never happen. The Great Depression never happened because we have the Federal Reserve. They're supposed to control interest rates, control the inflation, control everything. They pretty much did the wrong thing. What they did was tighten the money supply. They made it more difficult to get money. At a time when people are spending less money, you want to encourage them to spend money, not stop them. So they rose interest rates, made it more difficult to get loans. So people built less, people bought less. And when people are already unemployed and it's already pretty low, you just made it worse. FDR actually outlawed gold. He said gold cannot be used in money at all. You can only have it in jewelry. People had to use fiat money. The paper bills we have now, that's technically fiat money. But he needed that. He didn't want people to switch to some barter system on gold and totally ignore the United States government's currency problem. Now, there's a lot of reactions to the New Deal. These are all critics of the New Deal. And while you can look at each one to see what they were known for, Francis Townsend wanted to give more money to 65-year-olds. He wanted to give them a huge pension, not just a little bit, but a huge pension of $200 a month. Now we have the Social Security, which is kind of that, but just not as much. Huey Long was big. This guy actually wanted to give each American family an income of $2,000 a year. He said we can pay for this by taxing the rich. So he was far left. He wanted to do more for people. Father Coughlin was a Catholic preacher, and he was pretty much very anti-Jewish. He was a critic of Roosevelt, but to the point where he got shut down by the Catholic Church in his radio program. It was the church, the Catholic Church, that had enough of him. So Father Coughlin, after a while, when he continued these rants, the head of Catholic Church was shut down. Vatican said no more of that. But these are all critics of the New Deal. Typically, they think he didn't go far enough. I mean, there are people that are like, hey, this guy is trying to become a dictator, a king, on the right side that didn't believe the government should get involved. And then there's this group of people who essentially did think the government should get involved and thought he didn't do enough. But it's politics. Everybody has critics. And even I, who am a big fan of FDR, will tell you right now, this is probably the biggest problem with FDR's legacy. We talked about how he was his AAA, the NRA, how they were deemed unconstitutional because it violated the 10th Amendment, right? When the Supreme Court did this and they hinted at finding other programs unconstitutional, FDR was furious. And so he proposed. It was Chester's Poultry versus U.S. Supreme Court ruled that during a national crisis, Congress could not give the president any more powers than those that are actually in the Constitution, right? They said no matter how bad things get, he can't give him more powers. So FDR took that as a threat. He said the court is going to go back and find my other New Deal legislation unconstitutional and undo everything that I worked so hard for. So in 1937, he proposed a plan. FDR essentially said, hey, this is what we're going to do. Every Supreme Court justice over 70.5 years old should be replaced. And he also says instead of having just 9 justices, we should go to 15. Now, at this point in time, you need to keep in mind that who appoints the Supreme Court justices? The president. At this point in time, all members of the House and Senate are all Democrats like the president. So he's going to appoint up to 6 more and replace any that's too old. And he's going to get approved by the Senate because it's the same party. And he's going to have complete control over the judicial system. This is called the court packing scheme, when he wanted to pack the Supreme Court. Add more to it so that they saw it, so he had more of his people in there, and they would see it from his point of view. Essentially, this is him controlling another branch, right? He has the executive branch, that's his job. Congress is of the same party, so that's the legislative branch. But now the one branch that still had control, he was trying to influence so much that he would control it. And so when Star Test asked about this court packing scheme, oftentimes they want you to understand that he was taking power away from the judicial branch, or he was giving himself too much power. You also see cartoons of him dressed like a king. And in this case, he's counseling the Constitution of the United States, that's FDR. You can see this case, he wants the Supreme Court to all agree with him, saying yes, yes, yes. And Uncle Sam's like, what? You can't just control the Supreme Court like dummies. This was FDR's probably biggest flaw, because even his own party, the Democrats are like, whoa, that's not cool, that's too far, and they didn't get behind it at all, actually. They disagreed with it entirely, and it drops. But I will tell you this, every court case after that, the Supreme Court ruled with the president. So it's almost like they got a warning to watch what they were doing, and it worked pretty well. There's my last question, if you want to pause the video and do that. The last star question I have on here. Other than that, we're all we have left is a quick summary that I want you guys to take a look at. The walk away from the New Deal is the following. The federal government increases their power and size. Like before, they were nothing. Now they're in the stock market. Now they have housing. Now they have government programs. Eventually, they will have minimum wage. They're involved everywhere. And people wanted that. The New Deal changed things. Government has power and size. The government now has a responsibility to keep the economy running. No longer should the government stand and just wait. That was their job to make sure it didn't get too bad. And now every person is affected by the government. It could be the FDIC. It could be your job. Your taxes are going to be raised or lowered based on to support these issues. Your Social Security. Everybody is affected by it now. The New Deal changes everything. And that's it for this unit.